The West is winning, the words of the US Secretary of State, taking aim at China and Russia. Mike Pompeo also sought to reassure European allies concerned by President Trump's policies. But is the US stance on global politics really that positive for the Western powers? Or is it undermining their alliance? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Peter Dobby. Transatlantic relations are not what they once were. Neither is the relationship, indeed, between France and Germany. And European leaders are concerned by the US President Donald Trump's America First policy. They've differed with him in several areas, from Iran to China. This was reflected during their annual Munich Security Conference. Divisions arose between leaders as they discussed whether the West is losing influence to other global powers. The answer from the US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, was everything is just fine. Pompeo boasted the West is winning and the transatlantic alliance is not dead. He rejected remarks by the German president, who warned that the United States is putting its own interests first at the expense of its allies.
Und unser engster Verbündeter,
even our closest ally, the United States of America, under the current government, rejects the idea of an international community. As if the attitude of thinking about yourself first could be global politics. As if everyone started to think that it's right to think about themselves only. Great again, if necessary, at the expense of neighbors and partners. At least that's the way it appears.
A few recent quotes from Western leaders. These quotes frankly surprised me. The first was from the middle of 2017. Quote, "The fact that our friend and ally has come to question the very worth of its mantle of global leadership puts into sharper focus the need for the rest of us to set our own clear and sovereign course." End of quote. The second one is from about a year ago. It said, quote, "The multilateral order is experiencing its perhaps gravest crisis since its emergence after the Second World War." End of quote. The final one was from just yesterday. A quote suggesting, quote, that the United States rejects the international community, end of quote. I'm here this morning to tell you the facts. Those statements simply do not affect in any significant way or reflect reality. I'm happy to report that the death of the Transatlantic Alliance is grossly over-exaggerated. The West is winning. We are collectively winning. We're doing it together.
Well, the French President, Emmanuel Macron, does not agree with Mr. Pompeo.
When I look at the world as it is being shaped, and that is the theme of your conference this year, there is indeed a weakening of the West. 15 years ago, we thought that our values were universal, that we were going to dominate the world in the long term, that we were dominant in terms of technology, military, and so on. And then I look at the horizon of 10 to 15 years, we're going to be increasingly pushed by other agendas and other values. They are emerging.
The US and Europe don't see eye to eye on a number of policies, including President Donald Trump's decision to withdraw the US from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Several European countries also didn't join a US ban on the Chinese tech giant Huawei playing a role in their 5G networks. Mr. Trump has criticised European allies for not spending enough on defence budgets to support NATO, and the US opposes a new gas pipeline project known as Nord Stream 2 between Russia and Germany across the Baltic Sea. The EU considers Trump's Middle East plans a departure from international agreements on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. OK, let's bring in our guests. In Moscow, we have Glenn Dyson, Professor of International Relations at the Higher School of Economics and author of The Decay of Western Civilization and the Resurgence of Russia. Joining us from Brussels is Teresa Fallon, Director of the Centre for Russia, Europe and Asia Studies and formerly a member of the Strategic Advisors Group to NATO. We also have in London RODERIC. He's an Associate Fellow at the Asia Pacific Programme at Chatham House and formerly a Counsellor and Head of Research on Asia to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in Whitehall. Welcome to you all. Glenn Dyson in Moscow, if I can come to you first. Is the West winning?
I would say no. It seems like the West is weakening itself, especially if we compare it to 30 years ago when the Cold War came to an end. Now, at this point in time, the West was at its strongest. It had, well, to some extent won the Cold War, so it had a lot of material wealth, but also it had an ideological power, that is, or soft power, as it had a moral purpose. It saw itself as having the task of advancing liberalism in the world. Now, what we've seen over the past 30 years is that even something like liberalism can go too far. And over the last 30 years, people have been asking, well, what happened to the economies? Why is the economy becoming more and more unequal? Is the national culture being replaced with multiculturalism? The mass immigration? None of these questions, either political problems of the left or right, haven't really been able to been resolved within this neoliberal construct. So I think for this reason now, you're seeing more of the West fragmenting into different populist movements, both on the right and the left. And just on a second dimension would be the external one. Given that under this neoliberal hegemony we created after the Cold War, it didn't really leave any room for Russia in Europe, which is why now we have expanded NATO up to Russian borders, building missile defense on its borders, essentially forcing its neighbors to choose between East or West, and now the Russians are effectively pushing back. So I think the West is seeing an internal fragmentation, but also more confrontation with countries such as Russia, which was never effectively given any legitimate space in Europe after the Cold War.
Teresa Fallon in Brussels, was this for you a domestic speech delivered internationally by Mr. Pompeo?
At the Munich Security Conference that was just held over the weekend, he did say democracy is winning, and that kind of language is what resonates with the U.S. audience. But he was followed by Defense Secretary Esper, whose whole talk was pretty much China, China, China. So it's a very different narrative. And the Europeans felt that the Pompeo speech wasn't very well received and that it wasn't actually very well written. We've seen a decline in democracies throughout the world and an authoritarian rise. And the biggest issue right now for Europeans is how they're going to navigate between an authoritarian China and the U.S. Also, they're worried about Russia. So we have this difficult narrative and how the U.S. is going to map it out. They made it pretty clear at the Munich Security Conference that Europe is going to have to choose. And this is one thing that Europe does not want to have to do.
Roderick, why in London? So clearly the US expects the European countries to square off against China, focusing in on Huawei, this massive tech giant. Why does it need that to happen?
What, the focusing in on China? Because this is the number one preoccupation of the US and the US president at the moment in foreign policy terms, the confrontation with China. I mean, Europe recognizes that China is more of a competitor. Europe realizes that there is much that needs to be done to protect and promote our own interests vis-à-vis China, but that is not necessarily doing exactly what the United States says when the United States says it. And Europe has to find its own way, just as, I mean, in concert with the United States, perhaps, but not following everything that the US does. The triumph of liberalism, or whatever you like to call it, is not exactly the same as the triumph of the United States.
Teresa Fallon, coming back to you for a second. One could have been deafened by the silence from the delegations from Berlin, from Paris as well. Why is it so awkward for them?
Why is it so awkward for them? Because who doesn't want a free ride? So they're accustomed to the U.S. giving security through NATO, but they also see great economic opportunities with China. And China has made it very clear that they expect Europeans to fall into line. So no one wants to upset China. And these red lines are kind of invisible. So EU member states especially are very much under pressure. We see this happening in Sweden right now with almost daily comments from the Chinese ambassador criticizing the Swedish government. And there is no help from the rest of the EU. So each EU member state is pretty much on their own. And the inability for Europe to even come up with a China strategy or to speak with one voice has left EU member states on their own. So we saw, as you mentioned, at the Munich Security Conference, neither France nor Germany wants to upset China. And the most interesting thing was that one of the last speakers of the day was High Rep Borrell, and many people were already leaving by then. So it almost seems that the European Union is getting downgraded.
Glenn, in Moscow, coming back to you as well, there is another axis underneath this, or a possible axis, surely, and it's this. When Emmanuel Macron says Europe should deal with Russia, does he actually mean he should deal with Russia?
Well, now that Germany is somewhat weakened after Merkel is on her way out, certainly France sees itself as taking a bit of a leadership role within Europe. And I think what the others were saying is quite correct. Now that China's rising as a key rival to the United States, the US will see it as the first priority to challenge or to marginalize China. Now, from this perspective, the West they envision is one where the Europeans will fall in line and follow its Chinese policy. However, if the EU would do this, they would diminish their own ability to diversify their ties. They will become more dependent on the US and will go back to the Cold War structures where the EU had very little autonomy. So for this reason, I think that they have a different interest to have a different approach to China, but also with Russia. Now, Macron stood out compared to the other Europeans, though, in terms of wanting to improve relations with Russia. And of course, I think he's onto something, because Russia's main concerns, they're not unreasonable. This idea that their neighboring countries shouldn't be forced to look east or west, maybe uniting Europe under a big military bloc, which doesn't include Russia. Like, all of this creates very zero-sum structures. So you can resolve this through dialogue. But I think, of course, he sees this as his under his leadership, of course.
Roderick, why in London? Clearly for Mr. Pompeo, he seems to see a heavy-handed, slightly predatory approach when it comes to how the government in Beijing does what it does when it wants to carry through on its aspirations, particularly for Huawei. That's the key thing that we have to drill down into. If you were distilling all that down and giving that to the Foreign Office in London, would you be telling them that is factually correct, or it's just a worry that shouldn't really be dealt with?
It is both in and of itself. It's a worry, and in a wider sense, it's a worry. We haven't really come fully to terms with the implications of AI and technological change and what those will mean for foreign policy, for state security. And it is a very great risk, in my view, to commit very strongly to a Chinese company like Huawei, where there are requirements by the Chinese government for all Chinese citizens and organizations to respond to the government on national security issues. So I think we need to look at this both in terms of Huawei itself and more widely in terms of our security relationships and managing this critical cyber sphere that has really not been properly dealt with at an international level.
Teresa, would this be as big an issue as it apparently is if there was a stronger relationship between Paris and Berlin? Angela Merkel is soon to be a thing of the past, and her current defense minister has said, actually, yeah, I'll run the party, but I'm not going to stand for election next year when Germany goes to the polls.
That was the elephant in the room at the Munich Security Conference. Everyone is so used to Merkel and her safe, steady pair of hands, and now her appointed successor, AKK, has stepped aside. Why? Because of the rise of the right in Germany. This is a very serious narrative going on in the background, the rise of the right-wing party and what happened in Thuringia. So Franco-German cooperation on these issues have been stalemated. And Macron is seen as, a man with a big vision, but how is he going to implement this? This type of narrative actually repels the Poles. It upsets the Baltic nations. So it's actually causing more division within the EU. And people in Brussels will say, fine, we'd love to, work with Russia as soon as they leave Crimea.
Glenn Dyson in Moscow. So to quote that German defense minister, how does, and I quote, consensus of words become a consensus of action? We seem to be in a period of people trying to push other people to reinvent themselves, but nobody's quite clear what the direction is here.
No, and I think that's quite correct. You see now the EU being pushed in very different ways for a variety of reasons. Now, you just mentioned the technology sphere. Obviously, the Americans have been unable to really translate the security dependency by the Europeans into essentially geoeconomic loyalties. So you see the Europeans now signing up for their Huawei technology platforms. You see them signing up for the Belt and Road Initiative. Countries from Turkey and others are buying Russian weapon systems, and all of this goes against, irrespective of American objections and threats of sanctions. So you see now some are trying to establish autonomy, others are seeking more closer alignment with the US, especially Poland then. But then also in terms of Russia, the relationship is quite different because, of course, during the Cold War for many Eastern Europeans, the Cold War was largely about the dominance of Russia. So for them after the Cold War, they wanted not necessarily to erase the division lines, but rather to move to the east. And to a large extent, that's what happened. Now, if Macron says that he wants to have a different approach to Russia, then essentially what the Russians want is to remove the division lines in Europe. And that would obviously make the Baltic states and Poland quite uncomfortable, as that goes against their historical narrative and the way they see the main challenges being in the world.
And Roderick, picking up on that idea of a changing narrative, if France says we should be looking towards Russia, Russia is kind of pivoting towards Eurasia, surely. It's working on its relationship with Turkey to do with ongoing events, the situation in Syria as well. You've got the whole Brexit debate, which is still active in Europe. And Russia is saying, actually, no, we're going to start looking east, not south and west.
I mean, I think this is part of the underlying situation that we are faced with. That we are in a very fluid international situation at the moment, with things changing really quite rapidly, and there is less confidence, to be frank, in the international institutions that we had sort of grown up with, if you like, and these are not working as well as they might. But there is still a lot to be said for working towards a rules-based international order. You may not like the international order as it stands at the moment. You may be seeking to maneuver for your own particular country's advantage, but there is still a lot to be said for finding ways of working together to deal with some of the problems that we are facing as a world. Things like climate change, these can't be dealt with simply by geostrategic maneuverings.
Teresa, in Brussels, is the language wrong here? When Mr. Pompeo says the West is winning, if you have a winner, by definition, you have a loser. And that means that Washington is framing Beijing as being the loser here, because that's maybe not the most nuanced approach to have towards the Chinese government, and also that mindset that they always have as well.
It was very interesting because at the Munich Security Conference, Fu Ying brought up this issue of Huawei, and immediately in all the Chinese press, it was shown as a victory. But we've seen, while Europe kind of was asleep, China was able to create a lot of leverage by buying companies and businesses in Europe and creating leverage and also co-opting elites. So it's very difficult for Europe to speak with one voice on Huawei. And this is kind of a red line for the US. But this narrative of Cold War 2.0, I don't think it really fits the situation that we're in. We're really in uncharted territory. We've never seen this before. And some analysts have even said this is almost like a pre-war period, but with technology added. So I think it's I would agree with Roderick, that it's a very disruptive period. This transitional period is extremely dangerous. And we don't even have the vocabulary, we don't even have the language to describe really what is happening at such a rapid pace.
Roderick, why? Is this a pre-war period? And if it is, what form would that war take? We're told constantly now that the next big global war will not be guns, tanks and missiles. It will be hospitals closed down by remote. It will be a voting system that's completely obliterated because of a use of technology. It'll be people being manipulated, say, as well.
What we are saying when you say that kind of thing is that there are a whole load of new weapons and alternatives open to states to pursue their interest, particularly if we come to a very hostile situation. But if you look at it from the other side, there is no great value that I can see for widespread conflict of the kind you are talking about between big supranational, if you like, powers. We see endless nation-to-nation conflicts and within-nation conflicts going on. But the bigger ones are just so awful in their potential consequences that I think still people are drawing back or would draw back from the brink on that. And although we see a lot of manoeuvring, we see a lot of manoeuvring because it is a period of fluidity, and there are opportunities, and there are times when you might say yourself as winning or losing. But to describe relationships between China and the United States, or Russia and Europe, or Russia and the United States as ones where you can actually win or lose, I think is a very mistaken way of looking at things.
Glenn, coming back to you, in the immediate short term, if Mr. Pompeo / the Trump administration doesn't get what it wants, might there be a real consequence, and could it be a lack of information and intelligence sharing between the United States and its European allies?
It could be, because we've had not the exact same but similar instances in the past. That is, the U.S. obviously is the central power in the international system. Now, usually, once a hegemon emerges after war, in this instance a Cold War, it tends to develop an international system which seeks to benefit itself. Now, once this hegemon then declines, you see other countries, the rivals, beginning to come up with alternatives, and at some point, the authority of the hegemon starts to disappear, and this is kind of the very difficult and destabilizing period we're currently going into. So, the U.S. can be seen as renegating to some extent on the responsibilities it usually had towards its other Western allies. In addition, it's seeking to make sure that countries like China and Russia cannot challenge its authority. So at the moment, there's a lot in the air, and we're not really sure where the pieces are falling just yet.
Teresa, obviously, the Trump administration feels it has choices. The Trump administration believes all the other European countries have choices as well. For the authorities, for the powers that be in Beijing, what do they believe their choices are?
Well, I think China has a clear strategy to make the world safe for the Chinese Communist Party. And we've seen a growth of assertiveness on the part of the Chinese. And it's not just in their neighborhood. They expect certain behavior from everyone. So we say Huawei or the highway. So those countries that don't embrace Huawei, their businesses inside China will be punished. Now, this doesn't mean so much for a small country that really doesn't have much of a business interest in China. But for a big a country like Germany, they're really sitting on the fence here, because the intelligence services in Germany will say, don't buy Huawei, don't embrace it. Whereas the businesses are whispering in Merkel's ear, you must embrace Huawei or our companies will be penalized inside China. So it's this conundrum that these countries must face. And I think that China has really positioned themselves extremely well. I always say that the best strategy China has been able to do is to convince everyone in Europe that they don't have a strategy, and that they've been able to co-opt elites and invest very carefully and strategically, and now they can call the terms. We even saw in the UK, for example, half the House of Lords have some sort of tie to Huawei. So it wasn't much of a surprise when even the intelligence services were concerned in the UK about Huawei that eventually Boris Johnson has decided to embrace Huawei.
Thank you for that. The clock has beaten us as ever here on Inside Story. Thank you to our guests. They were Glenn Dyson, Teresa Fallon and Roderick Wine. Thank you to you too for your company. You can see the show again anytime by going to our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do check out our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Peter Dobby, and the team here in Doha, thanks for watching. We'll see you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.